For a long time, you have been working, building factories, gathering capital, and generating more and more accumulated income. A lot of money and dollars. But the big problem is that this money is at risk. How will you put this money into the official economy of the country? Here we are talking about if these sources are illegitimate. Of course, when you deposit this money in any bank, you will be asked where you got this money from. You also won't be able to buy movable assets, real estate, large institutions, or companies with this money without attracting attention. And again, they will ask you about the source of all this money, especially if all this money was accumulated in a short period of time. This large amount of money you have gathered will always be at risk. Also, this money will be subject to confiscation from you if you do not report the source of this money or prove the real source of this money. Where did you acquire it from? And the source must be legitimate. At this point, you definitely decide that you are going to launder the money. You are going to launder this money. How is money laundering done? And how does the money officially enter the formal economy of the country you reside in? Hello, I'm Adele. Our channel specializes in economics and e-commerce. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Let's start the story from the beginning. Simply put, money laundering is the process of turning money obtained through illegal means into money that appears completely legitimate to official authorities. And to learn how the money laundering system works and how it operates, how do these large institutions conduct money laundering operations? And how do business owners and wealthy individuals who have acquired large sums of money through illegal means do it? How do they carry out the process of money laundering and re-inject it into the official economy, the country they operate in, so that it appears to be completely legitimate money? Here, we will talk about the main systems used by those who want to launder money or by large entities that conduct money laundering operations, and how through these systems they directly recycle capital or recycle these assets and gains so that they appear as legitimate money within the country. This business model can be divided into three main stages. The first stage is the placement stage, and in this stage the person injects the illicit money for the first time into the official economy of the country. The second stage is the layering stage. In this stage, the person carries out a large and continuous series of economic and commercial transactions, which of course we will discuss in detail. As it is an attempt to conceal the original source of this money. The third stage is the integration stage, which is when this money returns in a legal and official manner into the country's formal economy, as if it were legitimate money with no suspicion of any kind attached to it, after it has been laundered. These funds then appear in front of the country's regulatory authorities to be completely legitimate, as if they came from trusted and well-known sources. Let me tell you that in most countries around the world, banks and financial institutions are legally obligated to report any type of suspicious transactions. Financial transactions where the source of the funds is unknown or not clearly identified. But what is considered suspicious from the perspective of these banks? What are the transactions that these banks consider to be suspicious? Of course, this varies from one country to another and from one bank to another. And as we mentioned, but this threshold is determined by the central banks and financial authorities of each country individually. Meaning the value of transactions which, if carried out by an individual or a single institution, would be considered a suspicious transaction, and they would place it on a blacklist to investigate the original source of these funds. You should know that typically money laundering is carried out through a large group or an interconnected chain of companies. And these companies are international, with numerous branches all over the world. We also find that these companies are owned by different individuals in various countries, as we mentioned. So, what types of companies can be used for money laundering operations? First, we have limited liability companies, and these are independent legal entities as is clear from their name. And of course, as we mentioned, these companies have limited financial liability, meaning that if these companies go bankrupt, the shareholders do not lose more than the capital they have invested in these companies, but their personal funds and in their own accounts will remain completely safe. Of course, here, if investors put money into these companies, they are completely protected from having their capital forcibly sold. Because as we said, the investor only loses the value of the capital inside the company, their assets within this company. We also have what is known as a trust fund. Trust funds are somewhat similar to companies. They are independent entities, much like companies. But in the end, both are separate legal entities, and whether companies or trust funds, both can own assets and both have limited liabilities. However, unlike companies, trust funds are very simple in the way they operate. Let's return to the topic of money laundering. Suppose, for example, that you are a businessman and a very successful person. This could be either through legitimate means or through illegitimate means. And all the work you do is based on providing goods or services to the public. Of course, the simplest way to own this company is to be a direct shareholder in it, or to be the owner of the company. But if someone files lawsuits against it, or if the company declares bankruptcy, you will lose everything. Yes, this company is a separate legal entity. And of course, you will not be personally liable for any debts of this company, but you will lose your business and your main source of income. This is where the solution comes in. You establish a holding company. And under this company, there is a very large group of subsidiary or secondary companies beneath the holding company. So if one of these small companies under the larger entity faces lawsuits or declares bankruptcy, it doesn't matter, because in this case, you would only lose one small subsidiary company, but the larger entity remains intact and unaffected. You will find that the rest of the companies remain operational and are working efficiently at full capacity and with all their capital. So here you would only lose one small subsidiary, which is a very minor value compared to the total capital. And you can, starting the very next day, establish another small company under the holding company which owns all the assets. Money laundering is done as follows. Investors open a very large number of companies. These are small entities under the parent company that we talked about, and they open these companies in a large number of different countries. Of course, we will find that there is a very large group of multiple companies in different countries. And many of these countries have a strong emphasis on confidentiality, danshi, or maintain strict secrecy regarding the information of entities and companies registered there. We will find that the authorities in a country have seen suspicion regarding the capital of a company. If it requests the other country or countries to disclose the owners of these companies or their data or the account numbers of these companies, then this country, which as we mentioned has strict confidentiality regarding information, and will say we will not disclose any data because our data is fully protected by law. Here, the business regulatory authority in this country will not disclose the ownership of the company, as we said, nor the size of its investments, nor its owners. Not the names of the direct owners, nor the amounts of capital, nor even the contracts. And they will not provide any information related to these companies. Of course, it is obvious that someone who invests a great deal of capital and a lot of time to establish a multi-layered business structure in different countries, of course he wants to cover something up. The issue is not about profit growth or establishing an investment, but here it becomes immediately clear that he wants to hide the sources of these funds, so he resorts to this trick. As we mentioned, he establishes different companies in different countries. He creates an international, complex, and ambiguous entity. Ultimately, what he wants is a legal document from a government authority in some country stating that this money is legitimate and part of the official economy of that country. These are the funds that will eventually return to the home country and to their original owner, the founder, in the country where he resides. Of course, these operating companies have always been established in countries where the regulatory system is somewhat weak. The question now is, are there measures being taken at the international level to combat money laundering? In other words, what are countries doing now, and what are the new international laws in the fight against money laundering? I can tell you that a great many laws have been enacted in numerous countries requiring companies to disclose the names of real individuals, not just legal entities. This means that any chain of companies must ultimately end with specific identifiable people, not with shell companies or companies in other countries. No matter how many successive layers of international companies they establish, in the end, real individuals, not legal entities, must be named. And of course, since these are actual people, the endless web of companies that was set up for money laundering purposes now becomes worthless and pointless. Because ultimately, we will have to identify specific real individuals. Additionally, there are now laws that require countries to significantly restrict secret accounts. In other words, there is no such thing as secret accounts anymore. For every account, if the regulatory authorities request to know its owner, these countries are obligated to disclose this confidential information, also as a measure to combat money laundering. Furthermore, they must disclose the transaction history of these accounts for any period requested by international regulatory authorities. Since this matter leads us to the topic of banks and financial institutions, you should know that if you intend to carry out money laundering, you would need strong institutions backing you in this regard. Here, we are specifically talking about financial institutions, namely banks. Banks are among the most important institutions involved in the process of money laundering. And of course, when the capital is large and you are wealthy enough to pay these institutions, the process becomes much easier. Banks are a very important target. Why? Because they can deliberately overlook any suspicious transaction in order to keep the client satisfied. A client who has money will inject it into the branches of these banks. Large deposits enable these banks to develop their financial capabilities. Of course, in this case, the bank's role is that it deliberately does not proceed in the correct direction, meaning that it takes this money and deposits it in the bank without asking about the source of the money and without any legal documentation for it. Banks are among the financial institutions that can truly assist in the money laundering process in a very effective way because they help the client structure their financial transactions. Banks also do this by establishing international companies and fake accounts that assist the client in the money laundering process. They do this fully aware that this money has come from illegal sources. However, of course, the secret deals that take place within the bank and are highly profitable for the bank make it largely turn a blind eye to this matter. Another method of money laundering which has become increasingly widespread, especially with the rise of digital technology, is laundering money through cryptocurrencies. Buying and reselling cryptocurrencies has become one of the most effective and widespread methods in money laundering operations, since these currencies can be purchased through digital platforms. Currencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and many others. What's notable here is that, as we mentioned, you can buy these currencies through digital platforms, but your identity on these platforms is completely hidden. On these platforms, you are represented by codes, just a series of numbers and symbols, so no one can track your account or know the real owner of that account. Investing in cryptocurrencies will make you completely anonymous on the internet, because cryptocurrencies deposit and operate using what is called the blockchain hard anonymous system. And as we mentioned, this system is completely hidden and no one can track individuals' financial transactions. Also, cryptocurrencies are based on decentralization, meaning that there is no specific government or central bank that controls, oversees, or monitors the movement of transactions within these Aktarat deals. Therefore, it is very difficult to track them or to coordinate between different international financial institutions in order to identify the real owners of these currencies. Let me tell you that money laundering operations, even though they may seem like a victimless crime, but this is completely wrong. Because in reality, money that comes from money laundering operations always originates from suspicious sources such as human trafficking, terrorism, and drug trafficking. In other words, even though money laundering itself is not a crime, it undoubtedly facilitates the most dangerous types of crimes around the world. In the end, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. See you in the next video. Have a good evening.